That night, after her husband beat her over and over for daring to confront his affair, Hannah went to bed without a single word. The next morning, David woke to the rich smell of his favorite beef rendang drifting up from the kitchen. Grinning, he followed the aroma down to the dining room where the table was covered with dishes as if nothing had happened. "Nice," he said smugly. "You finally understand what you did wrong." But when he pulled out his usual chair and saw who was already sitting there, his smile died. His face drained of color, then twisted into full-blown panic. Before we rewind and see how Hannah set all this up, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this keep you hooked, don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next ones. The night before, rain hammered the windows of their luxurious living room as if the sky itself was grieving for Hannah's marriage. It was almost 2 in the morning. She sat upright on the cream leather sofa, not reading, not watching TV, just staring at the front door. Her phone, screen cracked and dark, rested in her hand. Inside it were the photos that had killed whatever was left of her hope. David at a candlelit dinner, leaning in to kiss the cheek of a younger woman named Crystal. A friend had sent them from across the restaurant. It wasn't the first time Hannah had smelled betrayal on her husband's clothes. But tonight, something inside her didn't just hurt. It hardened. Outside, the low rumble of an engine cut through the rain. Headlights swept across the curtains. David was finally home. Hannah's heartbeat sped up, not from love, but from a cold mix of dread and disgust. The door flew open. David stumbled in, shirt rumpled, tie hanging loose, the sharp stench of alcohol tangled with a cloud of perfume that wasn't hers. He stopped, surprised to find his wife still awake. Instead of guilt, annoyance crossed his face as if she were interrupting his peace. He tossed his briefcase onto a chair and headed for the stairs without a greeting. "Where have you been, David? It's almost 3. Hannah asked quietly. Her voice was calm, but it sliced through the heavy air. That simple question hit like a lit match on gasoline. David spun around, eyes bloodshot, jaw clenched. He barked that she had no right to question him, that her job was to stay home, spend his money, and keep her mouth shut. Hannah didn't back away. She stepped closer and lifted her phone, its cracked screen glowing with the photo of David kissing Crystal in the restaurant. "Who is she?" Hannah asked. "And how could you do this to me after everything?" For a second, David froze, caught. Shame never showed up, only rage. His cheeks flushed an ugly red. To him, the problem wasn't the affair. It was being exposed. Without warning, his hand whipped across her face. The slap was so hard her body flew sideways, crashing into the console table. A glass vase shattered on the floor, shards skittering across the marble. Pain exploded in her cheek, her lips split, warm blood dripping onto her chin. But David wasn't finished. He grabbed her hijab, yanked her head up, and poured out a stream of insults no decent man should say to anyone, let alone his wife. He blamed her for his cheating, called her boring, cold, not enough of a woman for him. Blow after blow landed on her arms, ribs, and legs. He kicked her when she tried to shield herself, shoved her into the wall, pinned her in a corner like prey. Every breath burned in her chest. Her ribs screamed whenever she inhaled. The room spun. Yet through the storm of fists and feet, one thing made David pause. Hannah didn't scream. She didn't beg, didn't claw at him, didn't even curse back. She stayed eerily silent. Her eyes were wide open, not pleading, not hysterical, just cold, distant, almost dead. That emptiness in her gaze made David uneasy for a heartbeat. Then arrogance rushed in to cover it. He decided her silence meant surrender. In his twisted logic, he'd finally taught her a lesson. He let go of her hair, and she slid to the floor amid broken glass. "That's what you get for disrespecting your husband," he spat. He ordered her to clean up the mess in the morning and warned her not to tell anyone if she didn't want things to get worse. Then he staggered upstairs, the bedroom door slamming so hard the house shook. The rain outside roared on. Alone in the quiet aftermath, Hannah lay on the cold tile, every inch of her body screaming in pain, tasting blood and bitter resolve. After a long minute, she forced herself to move. Her hands trembled as she pushed off the floor, shards of glass crunching beneath her palms. She didn't bother cleaning. The broken vase could stay as a silent witness. Limping, she made her way to the downstairs guest room. She didn't turn on the light. Lightning flickered through the window, briefly illuminating the bruises already blooming on her face. From the torn pocket of her dress, she pulled out her phone and another small object, a simple digital clock she had bought a week earlier. Inside it was a tiny camera pointed at the living room. Her gut had told her something like this might happen. The camera had seen everything. Sitting on the edge of the guest bed, Hannah opened the app connected to the camera and watched the recording just long enough to confirm it was clear. Every slap, every kick, every vile word, David's face twisted in rage. Her fingers shook as she forwarded the video and a short message to her parents, Mr. and Mrs. Collins, and to their longtime family lawyer, Mr. Andrews. Then she pressed the phone to her bruised cheek, feeling both the sting and a strange, fragile sense of relief. For the first time, she wasn't hiding his abuse to protect the marriage. She lay back on the bed, eyes wide open in the darkness. She didn't sleep at all that night. At 4 a.m, the alarm on her phone buzzed softly. Hannah sat up slowly, every muscle protesting. Her ribs ached, her head throbbed, but her mind was crystal clear. She walked to the kitchen, not out of love, but with the precision of someone setting a stage for the final act. There, she pulled out the ingredients for David's favorite dish, Indonesian beef rendang. Her hands remembered the motions automatically, slicing beef, crushing lemongrass, stirring coconut milk and spices until the air filled with warm, complex aromas. To anyone else, it would look like a devoted wife cooking for her husband. Only Hannah knew it was a farewell offering. While the stew simmered for hours, messages buzzed on her phone. Her mother's voice messages were a mix of sobs and anger. Her father's were short and icy. Mr. Andrews replied with a promise. He had seen the footage, and he would take care of everything. He asked where she was, and if she felt safe. Hannah simply answered that David was asleep upstairs, and that she would be ready. As dawn crept in, she wiped the counters, set the big dining table with David's favorite plates, and arranged the rendang, white rice, and side dishes with almost ceremonial care. The living room had already been cleaned by the housekeeper David never bothered to know by name. Upstairs, sunlight stabbed through the curtains and into David's hangover. He groaned, head pounding, but as he sat up, the smell of rendang reached him. Even with the throbbing in his temples, his mouth watered. For a moment, flashes from the night before flickered through his mind. Hannah's split lip, her silence, but he pushed them away. In his narcissistic logic, the fact that she was downstairs cooking meant she'd accepted her place. In his mind, this pot of rendang was an apology. He showered, shaved, put on clean lounge clothes, and admired himself in the mirror. He liked feeling like a king whose queen knew better than to challenge him. Whistling, he walked down the marble stairs. The living room was spotless. The shattered vase and blood were gone. He nodded to himself, pleased. At least she knew how to tidy up. The house was oddly quiet. No clinking dishes, no footsteps. Only the rich scent of spices growing stronger as he neared the dining area separated from the living room by a decorative screen. He straightened the collar of his polo shirt and stepped through the opening, fully expecting to see Hannah hovering anxiously by the table, eyes swollen from crying, waiting nervously for his mood. The table was exactly as he imagined, a glossy wooden surface covered with steaming dishes, the rendang in a large bowl at the center. But his chair at the head of the table was already occupied. A man he knew very well sat there, back straight, hands clenched into fists on the table. Mr. Collins, Hannah's father, usually a warm, easygoing man, now stared at David with eyes so cold they might as well have been gun barrels. To his right sat Mrs. Collins, her eyes red and swollen, refusing to look directly at him, jaw tight with disappointment. Behind them stood Hannah's older brother Ryan, broad-shouldered and tense, and near the doorway waited Mr. Andrews and 2 uniformed police officers. David stopped dead. His stomach dropped. The confident smirk slid off his face. Morning, sir, Mom. Ryan, he stammered, throat suddenly dry. What are you all doing here? His eyes darted around, searching for Hannah. For one insane moment, he hoped she'd appear from the kitchen with coffee and smooth over the awkwardness. Hannah, he called, voice cracking. There was no answer. One of the officers shifted his weight. The room felt like a trap closing. Mr. Collins slowly pushed a plate of steaming rendang toward David. The scratch of porcelain on wood cut through the silence like a blade. Eat, Mr. Collins said. His voice was low, rough with barely contained rage. Hannah cooked this at dawn with a bruised face and a split lip because of you. She made it as her last act of charity toward the man who broke her. So eat, David. Enjoy it. It's the last good meal you'll taste before prison food. David let out a shaky laugh, trying to wave it off. He insisted it was just a marital argument, that this was a misunderstanding, that they shouldn't bring private problems into the law. He reached out, as if the right words could make the scene disappear. Ryan slammed a hand on the table so hard the cutlery jumped. "Don't you dare say my sister's name with that mouth," Ryan snapped, eyes blazing. "You think we don't know what you've done?" Mr. Andrews quietly set a tablet on the table and pressed play. The living room from last night filled the screen, Hannah standing, David's face contorted with rage, the first slap, the fall, the kicks, the insults. The audio echoed in the dining room, every insult, every thud of fist on flesh. Mrs. Collins covered her ears and sobbed. The officers watched, jaws clenched. David stared at his own cruelty in high definition and realized there was no way to talk his way out. One of the officers stepped forward, cold metal glinting in his hand. "David Ward, you are under arrest on suspicion of felony domestic violence and assault," the officer said. In seconds, David's wrists were cuffed behind his back. The rendang's aroma turned his stomach. As they marched him out of the house, neighbors peeked through curtains and around hedges. A few phones were already raised, recording. The police car's siren wailed as it pulled away from the gated community, cutting through morning traffic like a warning siren for his old life. In the back seat, wedged between two silent officers, David stared blankly out the window, his mind frantically insisting this was temporary, that money and connections would fix everything. At the station, the officers led him to a cramped interrogation room with peeling paint and flickering fluorescent lights. They uncuffed him, only to chain one wrist to a metal loop on the table. Then they left him alone. Minutes stretched like hours. The silence wasn't relief, it was a tactic. David's mind spun through half-formed plans. Call a friend in the police, call a judge he'd met at a golf course, offer Hannah money to drop the charges. Sweat soaked through his shirt despite the chill in the room. By the time the door creaked open again, his nerves were raw. Mr. Andrews walked in with a veteran detective. The lawyer didn't bother sitting. He opened a red file and spread out photos on the table. They were medical pictures of Hannah taken that morning. Her face swollen and bruised, her lips stitched, dark marks blooming along her arms, shoulders, and ribs. Next came a printed medical report. The detective tapped a highlighted section. "This is the part that changes everything," he said. "Your wife's blood work shows regular traces of a sedative, benzodiazepines. The exact same compound was found in the vitamins you've been handing her every night. Care to explain why you've been quietly drugging your wife for months?" David's mouth went dry. For 6 months he had been slipping low-dose sedatives into the pills he gave Hannah so she'd fall asleep quickly and stop asking questions when he came home late or left again to see Crystal. He had thought it was clever, a peaceful solution. Now, in a neat paragraph of medical jargon, it was being called what it really was: systematic poisoning. The detective calmly listed the charges they were considering: aggravated domestic violence, attempted poisoning, possible attempted murder, depending on long-term effects. Mr. Andrews leaned in and told him in a flat professional tone that they had more than enough evidence to pursue the harshest sentence. Hours later, they finally gave David his one phone call. His mind raced through possibilities and landed on the person who had always made him feel like a king: Crystal. He dialed her number from the police phone. When she answered, her voice was syrupy, curious about the unknown number. David quickly spun his story. He was being unfairly targeted by Hannah's rich family. It was all dramatized. He just needed bail money for a misunderstanding, and he'd pay Crystal back double as soon as he could access his accounts. The mention of double lit her up. 2 hours later, she arrived at the station in oversized sunglasses and designer heels, clutching a luxury handbag like a shield. She signed the paperwork, paid the hefty bail, and soon David walked out of the station as a man temporarily free, but under strict citywide restrictions, required to report weekly and barred from leaving town. He slipped an arm around Crystal's waist, kissing her cheek. promising that soon he'd divorce Hannah and they would live together in their mansion. Crystal smiled, already picturing herself as the new lady of the house. Before they reached the parking lot, Mr. Andrews intercepted them. He handed David a thick envelope. "This is notice of asset seizure and documents related to your prenuptial agreement," he said calmly. "You might want to read them before you start promising people houses." In the parking lot, David tore open the envelope. His eyes scanned line after line in disbelief. The mansion he proudly called his was, on paper, an asset in Hannah's name purchased by her father's company before their marriage. The cars he drove were company vehicles. The savings accounts he thought of as his had been frozen under suspicion of corporate fraud. The only money that was clearly his came from the paychecks he'd already blown on gambling, parties, and Crystal's gifts. Mr. Andrews reminded him that Hannah's family's auditors had been quietly reviewing the books for weeks. Then he walked away, leaving David standing in the fumes of the parking lot, the reality of his financial nakedness sinking in. Still clinging to denial, David ordered a rideshare to the gated community he'd just left in handcuffs. When they reached the gate, the security guard he'd known for years stepped out and blocked the car. David barked at him to open the barrier, but the guard stayed firm. "Sorry, Mr. Ward," he said, voice stiff. "I have written orders for Mrs. Hannah Collins. You're not allowed inside this neighborhood. All access codes have been changed." David stormed out of the car, shaking the iron gate like a madman. The guard quietly pointed to a large metal drum near the post. Inside, still smoldering, were the ashes of what had been David's expensive suits, Italian leather shoes and watch boxes, charred beyond recognition. Neighbors watched from a distance, whispering, some filming. David stared at the blackened scraps, symbols of the status he'd flaunted, now reduced to trash. He turned back toward Crystal, expecting outrage on his behalf, maybe a consoling hug. Instead, he saw uncertainty in her eyes, a calculating glint replacing worship. The man she had chased wasn't standing in front of a mansion anymore. He was gripping a gate he no longer owned, with cops, courts, and auditors circling. Questions were already forming in her mind. If the house isn't really his, what else isn't? They took another rideshare back to Crystal's downtown apartment, the car heavy with silence. Inside, she dropped her keys on the table, crossed her arms, and asked the question plainly. "Do you have any money that isn't frozen or in your wife's name?" David stammered about his salary, about future deals, about how this was all temporary. Crystal snorted and laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. She told him she'd gotten involved with a successful executive, not a broke criminal with a viral mugshot. She wasn't a charity. She wanted designer bags and five-star restaurants, not a man who brought police and debt collectors to her door. With a flick of her wrist, she tossed his cheap phone and worn wallet toward the door and told him to get out before she called building security. That night, David curled up on the cold tile of a small prayer room attached to a gas station, hugging his thin jacket around himself. He couldn't backtrack to his relatives. Most of them had seen the video already. He had a few crumpled bills in his wallet. He used some to buy a stale roll and a bottle of water, choking them down while trying to convince himself that tomorrow he'd fix things. He clung to the idea that he was still David Ward, star marketing director, the man companies fought over. He'd go to the office in the morning, talk to the CEO, smooth it all out. With that last scrap of pride as a blanket, he closed his eyes. Morning came with harsh sunlight and the sour smell of gasoline. David washed his face in the public restroom, tried to flatten his hair with his fingers, and tugged at the wrinkles in his only clean shirt. He took a cheap motorcycle taxi to the glass high-rise where he'd worked for 10 years. As he walked into the gleaming lobby, he half expected the receptionist to greet him, the security guard to nod respectfully. Instead, the two guards at the entrance exchanged looks filled with something between discomfort and disgust. No one opened the door for him. When he swiped his access card at the turnstile, the scanner flashed red and beeped sharply. He tried again and again. Same rejection. A line of employees formed behind him, murmuring. Some whispered his name. Others whispered, "That's him, the one who beat his wife," assuming he couldn't hear. A human resources manager, Mr. Harris, whom David used to treat like a subordinate, stepped out of an elevator and approached. Gone was the friendly smile. In a flat, controlled voice, Mr. Harris asked David to follow him, not to his corner office upstairs, but to a small meeting room on the first floor. Waiting there was the CEO, Mr. Donovan, face like stone. On the table, a tablet replayed the same CCTV footage that had been shown over Hannah's family breakfast, now with a social media interface framing it and a view counter racing upward. Mr. Donovan explained that the video had gone viral overnight. The company's accounts were flooded with angry comments demanding David's termination. More importantly, their largest new investor, a group led by Mr. Collins, had called that morning and made it clear there was no universe in which David could stay. The board had agreed. David tried to argue that his private life had nothing to do with his performance, reminding them of the record sales he'd delivered. Mr. Donovan slammed his hand on the table. Integrity mattered more than numbers, he said. No brand wanted to be associated with a man who beat and poisoned his wife. Effective immediately, David was fired for gross misconduct, with no severance. His name would be circulated quietly through the industry as someone no reputable company would touch. Minutes later, 2 security guards escorted David out of the building, carrying a battered cardboard box with a few personal items from his desk: a cheap mug, some pens, framed certificates that suddenly looked meaningless. He stood on the hot sidewalk, the tower of glass and steel looming above him, and realized the last pillar of his old identity had crumbled. No home, no mistress, no job. Regret began to seep in, slow and poisonous, but it had nowhere to go except back into him. Days later, the first mediation hearing for his divorce and criminal case arrived, dragging him into a different kind of arena. In the family court's waiting area, David sat hunched on a hard plastic chair. The shirt he wore was the same one he'd had on at the office, now even more wrinkled. His beard had grown in patchy and unkempt. His eyes were ringed with dark circles. Nights spent in mosques, on friends' couches, or in dingy shelters had carved years into his face. Still, deep down, a small delusion clung on. Hannah was soft-hearted. She would see his suffering and take pity. The door opened. Mr. Andrews entered first, followed by 2 junior lawyers, and then Hannah walked in. For a moment, David didn't recognize her. Gone was the exhausted housewife in worn loungewear. Hannah wore a fitted beige blazer and a long skirt, a soft silk hijab framing her face. The bruises were almost gone, hidden under a light touch of makeup that highlighted her calm features. Her back was straight, chin lifted. There was no trace of fear in her eyes. She moved with the self-possession of someone who had discovered her own worth. When they sat across from each other at the mediation table, David felt as if he was staring at a stranger who had outgrown him entirely. The mediator, a middle-aged judge with tired eyes, began with the formal question: was there any chance of reconciliation? Before Mr. Andrews could respond, David slid off his chair and dropped to his knees on the cold tile. Tears streamed down his face, some forced, some real. He clutched at his chest and poured out dramatic apologies. He blamed Crystal for bewitching him, swore the beating had been a one-time mistake, promised he'd changed now that life had punished him. He begged Hannah to remember their early years, to give him one more chance, to save him from prison. When he reached to grab the hem of her skirt like he used to when he wanted to manipulate her sympathy, the bailiff stepped forward, ready to intervene. Hannah didn't flinch. She didn't recoil in disgust either. She simply looked at him with a distant, steady gaze, as if he were a story she had once heard about someone else. Then she spoke, her voice soft but clear enough that everyone in the room heard every syllable. She said that the man she had loved had effectively died the first time his fist met her face. The person kneeling in front of her was just the shell of someone who only valued her when she served his ego. She felt no love left, only gratitude, to God, to her family, to the universe, that she had survived long enough to see his true nature fully revealed. She turned to Mr. Andrews and nodded. The lawyer slid a new stack of documents across the table. Bank records, fake invoices, screenshots of transfers from a charitable foundation run by Hannah's family, money meant for orphans and widows, quietly rerouted to accounts under Crystal's name. For 2 years, David had been skimming off the top of marketing budgets and skimming again from charity funds, feeding his double life. Hannah explained without raising her voice that she had known something was wrong for a while. She had chosen to stay silent and let the numbers pile up so that when the truth came out, It would keep him behind bars long enough that he could never hurt anyone else the way he hurt her. She didn't need his sorry. She needed accountability. Hannah's father and lawyer built a criminal case. In a corner of the city, David scrambled for any support he could find. He thought of one person who had always taken his side. His mother, Mrs. Ward, who still lived in their small hometown. From a payphone, he called her, voice cracking as he twisted the story. He claimed he was being crushed by a powerful rich family who hated him, that Hannah had exaggerated everything, that he was about to be locked up for something he barely did. His mother cried over the crackly line. She had spent her whole life defending him, indulging him, believing he was just misunderstood. She promised to sell her last goat to a Ford bus fare to come testify that he was a good son who would never hurt anyone. The courtroom was packed on the day of his main trial. Journalists, activists, curious locals, and Hannah's extended family all crammed into the wooden benches. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but enough sketch artists and reporters were present to ensure every word would be repeated outside. David sat in the defendant's chair in an orange vest, hands trembling slightly, eyes glued to the door. He watched his mother enter, leaning on a cane, her best kabaya pressed for the occasion, her headscarf carefully pinned. For a brief, naive moment, warmth flooded his chest. She had come. He imagined her voice cracking as she pleaded with the judge to show mercy, but instead of taking a seat behind him, his mother was guided to the witness stand on the prosecution's side. She swore to tell the truth with a hand on a holy book. The prosecutor asked if David was the devoted son he claimed to be. Silence stretched. Mrs. Ward looked at her son, tears streaming down her lined face. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled but carried through the room. She described 10 years of selling vegetables in the market and dropping coins into a savings account, building a small fund for her lifelong dream, a pilgrimage to Mecca before she died. 2 years ago, David had returned to the village, begging for loan money to save his business. Out of maternal love, she had handed him every cent. 6 months later, a neighbor's child who worked at a hotel in Bali sent her photos. David on a beach with another woman, not Hannah, drinking and laughing in a luxury resort. The money meant for his mother's spiritual journey had gone to finance adultery. I raised him, she told the judge, wiping her eyes. I fed him, but I failed to teach him to be a decent man. I'm ashamed. I came here not to defend him, but to see him punished before I die, because maybe prison will do what I could not. The courtroom buzzed with shock. David slumped in his seat, unable to meet his mother's eyes as she stepped down, leaning heavily on Ryan's arm, Hannah's brother supporting the woman whose son had hurt his sister. The final blow came with the last witness. To avoid facing the same prison term for receiving stolen funds, Crystal had struck a deal with the prosecutors. Cooperate fully, and they'd ask for a lighter sentence. She entered the courtroom in modest clothes, makeup minimal, long hair tied back, trying to look harmless. Taking the stand, she wept and painted herself as naive, saying David had pressured her into opening accounts, had showered her with gifts and promises while complaining his wife was cold and stupid. She detailed how he laughed about Hannah behind her back, how he bragged that his in-laws' money would always protect him. Every word she spoke cut deeper than any punch. David exploded, yelling that she was lying, that she was just as greedy. The guards moved in, forcing him back into his chair. The judge called for order. With all the evidence laid out, video footage, medical reports, lab tests, financial records, testimonies, the verdict was inevitable. The judge's voice was steady as he read the decision. Guilty on all counts of aggravated domestic violence, systematic poisoning of his spouse, embezzlement and fraud involving charity funds, and theft from his own mother under false pretenses. The judge noted his lack of genuine remorse and the cruelty of drugging and beating someone who depended on him. David Ward was sentenced to 15 years in prison and a massive financial penalty. What little remained of his assets would be seized. As guards took hold of his arms to lead him away, David's gaze snapped to the front row. Hannah rose to her feet. She didn't clap or smile vindictively. Her face was calm, suffused with a quiet relief that seemed to light her from within. She wrapped an arm around her mother's shoulders, squeezed her father's hand, and thanked the prosecutors with a firm handshake. She did not, even for a second, glance back at David. He screamed her name, called out apologies and promises, but his voice was swallowed by the buzz of the courtroom and the clink of his own chains. In that moment, he understood that the worst punishment wasn't the concrete walls waiting for him. It was being erased from the lives of people who had once loved him more than he deserved. 5 years crawled by behind bars. Overcrowding and good behavior earned David an early conditional release, but it wasn't freedom in any meaningful sense. He emerged thinner, older, hair streaked with gray, teeth missing from years of poor prison nutrition. No corporation would hire a man whose name still popped up in search results next to words like abuser and charity thief. His mother had died 1 year into his sentence, refusing to visit. His relatives had long stopped taking his calls. He drifted between temporary jobs, hauling crates at the market, picking trash for recycling, until he found a semi-steady gig at a rundown roadside diner on the edge of the city, washing dishes in exchange for a small wage and leftover food. One slow afternoon, while he stood at the sink up to his elbows in greasy water, the old TV mounted in the corner crackled to life with a local news special. "Today we honor one of this year's Women of Inspiration," the anchor announced. Grainy footage shifted to a glittering hotel ballroom. A woman in an elegant, modern hijab walked up to the stage, accepting a glass trophy with a steady smile. David froze. It was Hannah. If anything, she looked younger than before, confidence radiating from her like light. The reporter explained that she now owned a thriving catering company and a chain of restaurants, and had founded a non-profit organization that provided shelter, training, and legal support for survivors of domestic violence. Beside her on the stage stood a man in a dark suit, his hand resting proudly at the small of her back. A pediatrician, the report said. Her husband, Dr. Aaron. In the front row of the audience, cameras caught Mr. and Mrs. Collins tearfully clapping while bouncing a toddler on their laps, Hannah's little daughter. It was the family portrait David could have had if he'd treasured it when it was his. The diner owner snapped him out of his trance by dropping a metal plate on the counter. "Lunch," she grunted. On the plate sat some cold rice, slick with leftover rendang gravy scraped from the bottom of a pot, and a small, overcooked scrap of beef, food usually reserved for stray cats or thrown away. The smell rose up, familiar and cruel. It yanked him back to that morning years ago when he had stood over a lavish table, smirking at Hannah's perfect rendang, while her father waited in his chair. Back then, he had rejected a feast seasoned with love and one last thread of loyalty. Now he sat on a plastic stool by the back door, shoveling cold, rubbery meat into his mouth because hunger didn't care about pride. Each bite tasted like ash and regret. Tears blurred his vision and dripped into the greasy sauce. On the TV, Hannah finished her acceptance speech with a calm smile, thanking her family and the women who trusted her foundation with their stories. The audience applauded. In the dingy kitchen, David choked on his food and swallowed his grief. That night, rain tapped gently against the windows of Hannah's spacious, warm kitchen. The air was once again filled with the smell of coconut milk and spices slowly thickening into rendang. But the meaning behind the dish had changed completely. Hannah hummed a little tune as she stirred the heavy pot, wearing a cheerful pastel apron. Strong arms slid around her waist from behind. Dr. Aaron kissed her cheek and teased that just the smell of her cooking could cure his patients. She laughed, bumped him playfully with her hip, and turned off the stove. In the dining room, her parents set the table while her daughter toddled around with a spoon in her hand, making everyone laugh. This time, rendang wasn't a last meal for a monster. It was a celebration of a new life built on respect. Across town, in a cramped rented room with peeling paint, Crystal sat on a thin mattress, knees pulled to her chest. Someone pounded on the door, the landlord demanding 3 months' rent she hadn't paid. She buried her face in her hands, trembling. The glamorous clothes and sparkling jewelry were gone, sold off piece by piece. Years of chasing easy money and older men with deep pockets had left her with nothing, no savings, no security, no true friends. Her once bright beauty had faded under stress and cheap cosmetics, lines etching themselves early around her eyes and mouth. She stared into a cracked mirror and saw not the seductive other woman she'd imagined herself to be. but a tired stranger who had helped destroy a good woman's home and gotten nothing lasting in return. Back in Hannah's neighborhood, the rain had turned into a light mist. A hunched figure moved along the sidewalk, pulling a torn sack filled with bottles and cans. David's back ached with every step, his shoes soaked through. As he shuffled past a familiar high wall, a wave of warmth hit his nose, the unmistakable aroma of rendang drifting through a vent. He paused by the gate he once breezed through in expensive cars. Through a gap in the curtains he could see silhouettes at the dining table. Hannah lifting her daughter into a chair, her father pouring drinks, her mother laughing at something Dr. Aaron said. Light spilled from the windows, turning the rain into tiny shards of gold. For a heartbeat, the urge to press the doorbell rose in his chest, to beg for a plate, for forgiveness, for some acknowledgement that he still existed. But he knew better. He had forfeited every right to that home the moment he decided his ego mattered more than his wife's safety. He lowered his head, tightened his grip on the sack, and walked on into the darkness, feet splashing through puddles. Behind him, laughter and the clink of cutlery floated into the night, reaching his ears and then fading away. In that house, Hannah smiled, kissed her daughter's hair, and silently promised herself that as long as she lived, no one would ever raise a hand in anger under that roof again. If you've stayed with me until the end of this story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what you think about the way karma finally caught up with David. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that the first time someone hits you is already one time too many, and that walking away can be the beginning of a much better life.